really looking forward to this conversation. Ben and I have not seen each other in a number of years, but I remember hearing about this project early on, and so I'm excited to be here with you all to sort of talk about it at its completed stage. I will apologize because my voice has been going for several weeks, so hopefully we'll make it through uninterrupted tonight, but I apologize if it fades out at all, and if you can't hear at the back, please do just shoot a hand up and I will project. Ben, I want to ask you, Sherman's March to the Sea is one of these events that is, I think, in many ways familiar to people who are students or interested in the Civil War, but it's also an event that is so overlaid with myth and memory, and all that's so tangled. I wonder if you could just talk for a few minutes about how you perceive the march. What was it? What was its purpose? How did, and particularly, what did William Tecumseh Sherman understand its point to be?
Sure. Happy to answer that. And just quickly, I just want to say thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. It's always very nice to be in a bookshop, especially one that's nice. So thanks for having me. So Sherman's March is one of these iconic moments in the Civil War. It starts in mid-November 1864. It's a march from Atlanta to Savannah. Includes about 60,000 soldiers, lasts maybe a month and a half, 250 miles. It has always forever been remembered for the fire and guns. One of the things that Sherman wants to do when he leaves Atlanta is he cuts loose of the supply lines to make the march, and he wants his army to forage off the fields and plantations of Georgia, both to sustain themselves, but he's also very explicit that one of the things he wants to do is to target the material and emotional wherewithal of white Southerners to keep up the fight. And so because of this, amongst historians, the question has always been whether or not these tactics or this purpose birthed the beginnings of total war, meaning that this preview what would happen in Europe in the First and Second World War, Vietnam, some of these other modern conflicts. But I also think it lent itself to, at least from my fellow Georgians, this way of understanding the march that is all about white grievance. It's all about the tenacity of Sherman's army, the intensity of the march. It's these two interpretations that I think has allowed it to kind of live on primarily as a military event, and one that focuses again on Sherman, his cult of personality, on the fire and guns, the level of destruction. And I can say, as a native Georgia, I've still met plenty of people who see Sherman as a war criminal or as something of an enemy, and that's generally how I think we've remembered it. But one of the things I try to show in the book is that for enslaved people, it was yes, a military event almost by definition, but it was also much more than that. It was always a liberation event, and as I try to describe it in the book, a freedom movement.
Yeah, that's so. As sort of from a writerly perspective, I'm curious if there was a moment as you were researching this that you thought, I'm looking at that sort of transitioned you to seeing Sherman's March as a freedom event in a way that it has generally not been understood. Yeah. So I'm curious if there was an encounter in the archive or a moment in sources that really changed your understanding of the march.
Well, it's funny. The book begins by reading not any sort of sources or work of history, but a work of fiction. Maybe some people in the audience are familiar with E.L. Doctorow, the great historical fiction writer. I think Doctorow is amazing. He's probably best known for Ragtime, which is a book about America at the turn of the 20th century. But Doctorow also took on the march in a book he called simply The March. And as Doctorow did in Ragtime and so many of his other books, he included in his story of the march an almost kaleidoscopic cast of characters. Truly, it's a dizzying amount of characters to keep up with, but somehow, as Doctor always did, he made it work. There's a German-born U.S. Army surgeon. There is a Southern debutante who becomes the surgeon's love interest and sidekick, which is kind of a weird story. There's a couple of tragically comic Confederate prisoners of war. Even Sherman himself appears as a central character in the story. But Doctorow also included as one of his characters a freedwoman by the name of Wilma Jones, who drops everything when the army comes through, runs to the army, and follows the army all the way to Savannah. You later learn that Jones is the mother of another character that appears in another Doctorow book, but I won't spoil that. But nonetheless, as a native Georgian and as someone who loved history and wanted to pursue history, this struck me as interesting because I knew that Jones wasn't likely a singular character. She was likely a composite character, that there were other Wilma Joneses out there. And so the book really started with trying to think of how we could tell the story of Wilma Jones, not from a historical fiction perspective, but from perspective of history. And then I think that was really the start, but then when I realized this project had legs was when I discovered that when Sherman's outside of Savannah, he speculates that there are as many as 20,000 freed refugees following his army. That means that's 20,000 Wilma Joneses, 20,000 people who dropped everything, fled to the army, and arrived in Savannah. And that's an astounding number. Savannah itself, in 1860, had a population of 22,000. In Atlanta, which of course is now the great metro in Georgia, only had a population of 10,000. So we're talking about a movement of people through the army, the end of an army of 60,000, that's the size of a small southern city. So I think when I discovered the scale of this movement, that's when I realized that I think there was a bigger story to tell.
Yeah, that's, I love the sort of the idea of trying to uncover the stories of people like Wilma Jones, and The March is a tremendous novel. If you've not read it, I recommend it highly. But I think what's so interesting, right, is that what you have in this book is you have very different perspectives on what the march is supposed to be, right? You talked a bit about how Sherman envisioned the march and its purpose in ending the Civil War, right? Mm-hmm. But the enslaved people who enslaved and then freed people who marched with the army, ultimately, as you say, 20,000 people have a very different vision. Can you talk a little bit about how they look at Sherman, how they look at the Union Army, and maybe a little where this fits in sort of the broader trajectory of emancipation during the Civil War?
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, it's very clear when we started writing this book that everyone from Sherman, the Army's high brass, to the soldiers, to freed people, to white Southerners, all had different understandings of what this moment meant for them. And what's interesting is that Sherman, at this point, is slowly learning to embrace emancipation, but it's been a slow evolution. I'm not sure he ever fully got there, though he liked to style himself as a liberator of sorts. But nonetheless, he issues, as part of his orders for the campaign, an order about what the Army should do for freed people who came to his lines. And he says that freed people who arrive at the Army may be taken along if they're able-bodied and can take care of themselves and presumably work for the Army. But that the soldiers themselves should see their own men and the Army's movement as their first priority. And this order to me was always kind of fascinating because, on the one hand, it illuminates how Sherman viewed emancipation, which he always conditioned it on labor, what kind of labor free people could do for the Army. And if a free person could do some sort of labor, that often was a way for them to access the Army. But also, the order is very ambiguous. It doesn't really tell the soldiers anything, right? It's fairly open-ended for their interpretation. But more importantly, it assumes that the Army is going to be the only arbiters for what this moment looks like. It assumes that it's going to be the soldiers who are going to be able to make these decisions. And one of the things that happens and unfolds through Georgia is that free people run to the Army in such incredible numbers every step along the way that it becomes very clear that they, in a sense, have real power in what this moment's going to look like. And are going to run to the Army no matter what Sherman's orders are not. And so free people from the moment the Army moves through, they begin realizing that this is a real moment of opportunity for them, and that the Army, despite not always seeing themselves as such, there were some soldiers who viewed their purpose as being this, they viewed it as an army of liberation, and a real vessel of their own freedom.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because when we talk about and teach the Civil War, there's this tension about, well, is the Civil War is obviously caused by slavery, but is it fundamentally about slavery? Is it fundamentally about union? And what I think your book depicts so well is those things, the intersection of those things, and how different people's purposes overlap with one another. Because on the one hand, you have Sherman, who has these very ambiguous orders, but also one of the things I really liked about the book is your invocation of the idea of Jubilee. could say a little bit about this idea of the Day of Jubilee and how that intersects with Sherman's March.
And I forgot to answer the question about where this fits into the larger kind of history of emancipation, how historians are writing about it. And if I could just say, one of the things that historians are recognizing is that the experience of emancipation for so many enslaved people looked like a real refugee experience. It was one that was constantly insecure, uncertain, unstable. It was one in which freedom itself was always undefined. This is well before any kind of ideas about citizenship or asylum. Freedom, in a sense, was always trying to be defined in these moments. And many historians have been writing about emancipation from this perspective. Many of them have adopted the refugee framing to do so. And one of the reasons they have done that is because there's been a ton of new work now that has documented how basically wherever the army went, there were always large encampments of freed people who had run to the army and then built essentially refugee camps. You see this quite a bit in Virginia, sort of the eastern shore of Virginia, but you especially see it in the Mississippi Valley, around Memphis, and I guess here we are in Oxford, right, and then sort of this part of the country, and around New Orleans. And so it's the discovery of these camps that, for all intents and purposes, were refugee camps that have lent itself to seeing them as such. This story, I think, kind of fits into that, but what's different here is that the refugee people are on the move, and Sherman's army is moving in such a way that it's impossible to build these camps. So that's part of how this fits into the larger history of emancipation in this moment. But Jubilee is a really interesting idea that I use as kind of a metaphor in the book. And it's an Old Testament idea. It comes from Leviticus. And it describes a moment in, or a part of Hebrew law, in which every 50 years, basically Hebrew society would regenerate itself. Land was to lie fallow for a full year, debts were resolved, enslaved people were to go free, large estates were broken down and split into smaller estates. And it was meant for society to truly regenerate itself. This idea exists, it gets adopted by radical labor groups in the early 19th century. It gets adopted by abolitionists and other Christian millenarian groups who view it as kind of a universal emancipation that might presage the coming of Christ. For enslaved people who used Christianity as a real cornerstone of their culture, Jubilee was an idea that they believed it had real merit and was based in reality. And so when emancipation happens, and especially here on the March, it is the metaphor and the idea that enslaved people turn to make sense of this incredible moment that's happening all around them. And so this idea of Jubilee becomes the kind of metaphor of Sherman's March. Enslaved people invoke it, they refer to it, they describe this as a day of Jubilee, as Jubilee happening. Even the soldiers themselves, and even the famous song, Marching Through Georgia, that was a kind of an old 19th century song. It's Sherman's army is there to bring the Jubilee. So it sort of figures all throughout the story in different ways, but I think serves as a metaphor for what it meant for folks.
Which again, one of the things that I think your book does so well is gets at the contradictions, right? Because on the one hand, you have this Jubilee, and that's something that the enslaved, and we could call them enslaved people, we could call them freed people at this point, following with the army, absolutely invoke. But on the other hand, as you point out, this is not only a refugee camp, but it's a refugee camp on the move, and it's a camp that's on the move heading into winter.
Yeah.
Which is, we could talk about that, but it's one of the things that I thought, if you could, maybe you could talk for just a minute or two about, what does the experience of a refugee, obviously there's no one experience when we're talking about 20,000 people, but what does the experience of a refugee following along with Sherman's army look like?
Yeah. Well, it's one of real hardship. I mean, they're moving at the tail end of the army. Sometimes during the day, as best I could tell, the lines would get elongated. They would split from the army, but then at night they would try to press into the camps for some sense of security. In some cases, I think, for being able to share in the forage. But it was one that was always dangerous. There was a unit of Confederate cavalry led by Joseph Wheeler that was always circling around Sherman's men. They were always kind of present there. And an encounter with Confederate cavalry could be deadly for the refugee use was always one of real danger. But two other things I think stand out. One is that the refugees, many of them, their accounts, certainly not all, but there are accounts of them coming to Sherman's lines in wagons, on horses, carrying food, dressed to their best, with suitcases, right, carrying their own clothes, which seemed to me to indicate that they were there for the long haul, right? They were going to follow the army, come what may, and many of them did. The other theme that showed up when I was writing this is that all throughout the march, they acted as the Army's allies. Someone I was doing a radio program described them as the Army's fifth column. Sherman had 4 columns through Georgia. And in a sense, it's true. I mean, they acted as intelligence agents. They were scouts. They pointed the way down footpaths through the woods. Sherman himself, when he would come up to a town, he would sometimes ask for local enslaved people for their knowledge, for the landscape of where Confederate cavalry had been. And there's just incredible stories of how central enslaved people were to the success of the Army. And maybe the best story, though I have a lot of best stories, is what happens when the Army would go to begin doing the foraging. The reality is that many Southern white families knew the Army was coming, so they would bury their local or their treasures, or they would hide their horses. But of course, they wouldn't do it themselves. They forced enslaved people to do it. And so when the foragers arrived on the plantations, the enslaved people were incredibly happy to show the Army where some of these horses had been hidden, where things had been buried. In many cases, they used it as a bargaining chip to convince the soldiers to let them follow along and let them join the march. Another great example of how central they were is what happens when the Army gets near Savannah. This is a part of the state where the plantations there are less abundant, sort of the rice swamps north of Savannah. There are more rivers and swamps. The march isn't moving nearly as quickly or as efficiently as it was previously. And there's real fears among the soldiers that they may come back empty-handed, and they may actually stall out outside of Savannah. But they are sustained and fed because enslaved people teach them to prepare rice. Sherman's army was full of Midwesterners, folks from Indiana. Maybe they'd had Indiana, Ohio, other places. Maybe they'd had rice before. They certainly didn't know how to use a mortar and pestle. They didn't know how to husk and hull it. They didn't know how to really cook it. But in these few kind of nervous days outside of Savannah, the Army is sustained by enslaved people teaching them how to prepare rice. And then the best story, I told you I had a lot of best stories, and this is, I think, a pretty striking image, is that many of the refugees found work for the Army or were impressed into service, which is a different story entirely, but nonetheless, worked for the Army as military pioneers, which is a Army term for basically a manual labor. And in normal conditions, they would do things like bury the dead, dig latrines, that type of thing. But along the march, they were principally road builders, which means that all throughout Georgia, out in front of the Army, there were scores of formerly enslaved people who were literally paving the road for the Army as it approached Savannah, which I think is a pretty striking image and speaks to just how important they were to the Army's success. So it's a story of real danger, of real hardship, but it's also a story in which enslaved people all along the way were central players in this episode, in this story.
One of the I felt like one of the hinge or inflection points in the book is this moment at Ebenezer Creek. I wonder if you could just sort of talk for a minute about, they're somewhat famous, but I think they're worth introducing. What happens at Ebenezer Creek, and can you talk a bit about the fallout from this moment?
Yeah, so Ebenezer Creek, I think, is maybe the most famous episode in this story. It's definitely the most tragic. And it happens because of one of Sherman's subordinates, a man named Jeff C. Davis. Now, I want to specify this is Jeff C. Davis, not Jeff F. Davis. This is Jeff C. Davis from southern Indiana. And Davis is someone who had already developed a kind of villainous reputation. In 1862, he actually walked into one of his superior's office, a fellow Union general's office, pulled out a gun and shot him, killed him in cold blood. But Davis got off, in part because they needed good soldiers, they being the Army. And so Davis completely got off after killing this man, William Bull Nelson. But nonetheless, here he is in Sherman's army. He commands the 14th Army Corps, which is one of the 4 columns in Georgia. And his line is the closest to the Savannah River. which is important because that means that as he begins nearing Savannah, his line is going to cross the most rivers, the swampiest terrain. And he, of all of Sherman's corps commanders, did not like the fact that the refugees were following him. And in fact, he wrote back to Sherman specifically saying that something needed to be done to block the refugees and keep them away from his lines. And it's unclear how Sherman responds. We don't really know. But we do know how Davis responds. And his answer to what he perceives as this problem is that he essentially decides to begin pulling up his temporary bridges that allows him to cross these rivers before the refugees can cross. He does this once at a place called Buckhead Creek, but he likely does it a couple times more. And then he does it again at Ebenezer Creek, and this is where disaster strikes. Because as he's doing this, Confederate cavalry is hovering around the army. And as soon as he pulls up the bridges crossing Ebenezer Creek, Confederate cavalry barrels into the refugees who are stranded on the bank. Many jump into the water to try to escape. Many do not. Those who do not are likely killed or captured and re-enslaved. Many of those who jumped into the water didn't make it. They drowned. Some made it across, but it's very clear for the soldiers that some of the families that had been following previously before Ebenezer Creek were no longer traveling as family units. And I should say Ebenezer Creek, it's called a creek, but it is really one of those kind of classic low-country intercoastal waterways. It's really a bayou of the Savannah River. It's about 20 miles north of Savannah. And this time of year in December, when it happens, the water level is likely very high. And the crossing itself is really close to the Savannah River itself, and so there's a pretty strong current. And so it is Ebenezer Creek, but we're really talking about a much bigger body of water that has a faster current than what the name itself might imply. And so this becomes a really important turning point in Sherman's march. Turning point for the soldiers because they recognize just how willing enslaved people were to risk real threats of danger to get to where the army was going. It becomes a turning point for the refugees because they can't turn around now. To do so would be to try to recross the creek or the river and run headlong into Confederate cavalry. And it matters because when Sherman arrives in Savannah, it's unclear how, but word of Ebenezer Creek has gotten back to D.C. So much so that Edwin Stanton, who is the Secretary of War, he comes down to Savannah presumably to requisition cotton that's left in the city, but he also pulls out a newspaper and begins asking Sherman questions about Ebenezer Creek, what actually happened. And this is one reason why in Savannah, Stanton will call a meeting with him and Sherman and 20 of Savannah's black religious leaders. And the meeting is what to do about the freedmen of the state of Georgia, but everyone, I think, knows it to mean both free people in Georgia more broadly, but also the refugees that have followed Sherman's army here to Savannah.
Yeah. I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions, but kind of building off that moment, one of the things that your book does is it's about Sherman's march, but it takes sort of the, from Savannah, it takes the history of march in a direction that most other histories of the march don't go. In that it doesn't so much follow Sherman up into the Carolinas as follow the people who were themselves following Sherman on their own journey. And I wonder, we don't need to give away where the book ends, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is that this, I wonder if you could talk a bit about just how you see the march intersecting with not just the history of the Civil War, but the history of Reconstruction and the challenges that the government and reformers and freed people face as they negotiate the lives that the march has created.
Yeah, it's a great question and a great point. And I do see the march as being really a kind of early battle of Reconstruction. And when I was beginning to write this, I knew about the story of Sherman's march. I'd grown up in Georgia. In fact, I'd traveled his route many times to the coast. It's one of the reasons I think I was kind of interested in doing a project like this. But I was also really familiar with the story of what happens in the Low Country because I had spent a lot of time there, knew a lot about it. But I wasn't really sure how they would intersect, and I thought maybe they would, but I was surprised at just how they do intersect. Because the reality is that the aftermath of Sherman's March, this is a movement that is so big the aftermath is going to play a huge role in the shaping of what Reconstruction looks like, particularly on the Sea Islands between Charleston and Savannah. In part because Sherman begins trying to settle them there. He launches this real movement of the refugees down the Ogeechee River, which is just south of Savannah, up to the islands around Port Royal and Beaufort, which had been a freedmen's colony from 1861 to about 1864. And this is a movement that really sets off a real refugee crisis there on the islands. But also, it's out of this meeting that he has in Savannah that he issues his Field Order Number 15, which begins setting aside requisitioned plantation land from Charleston in the north to Jackson in the south for exclusively black homesteading. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to show that this order would have never happened if not for the refugees. That it's the necessity of trying to deal with this incredibly large movement that you get this order, and then when you get this order, now suddenly you have land reform as a real possibility for Reconstruction. And so the refugees, in a sense, have, through their own movements, have uncorked this much wider Reconstruction than I think that even someone like Sherman would have imagined. But it's as I said, in dealing with this aftermath, it sets the stage for many of the challenges and the questions that will come later when Reconstruction begins more properly. So it was a real intentional decision on my part not to follow the Army really to South Carolina, and instead focus almost exclusively on what happens on the coast, because in some ways that's where the real political questions arise.
I wonder, one more question, and I want to turn things over to the audience, because I'm sure that this book has inspired a lot of questions. I'm curious again, and were there people that you encountered in writing this book that particularly intrigued you, or like you said, you've got a lot of great stories in this book. Were there stories that particularly drew you in, as you people or stories or moments that really drew you in as you were writing it?
Yeah. No, there definitely is, and there's lots of different ways to answer this question. But one of the things that's kind of interesting about doing a book like this is that the refugees themselves, I think, throughout history have been nameless and faceless, and they appear in the records, but you don't always get a name, you don't always get a background, you get real sort of tidbits and snippets of information about their lives. But I was able to nonetheless tell a story about them and sometimes find really amazing stories because the soldiers wrote about them. The soldiers produced an incredible amount of writing about their experiences, particularly in the years immediately after the war, especially when they realized that publishers would pay them for them, right? Which is great for me because it got printed, I could read it, and they wound up preserved. But again, this was an army of Midwesterners, many who maybe never seen slavery, understood slavery, it was their first experience with enslaved people, but they knew they were taking part in a important moment in American history. I mean, they viewed this as the great campaign of the Civil War, so they're very willing to write their experiences, and one of the things that became so impressive for them and memorable is their interactions with enslaved people. And so it's through their writing that I was able to glean these larger stories of enslaved people. And if I had to pick maybe two people in particular, one is a adjutant general who travels with Sherman by the name of Henry Hitchcock. He is someone who worked in Missouri politics before the war, but he wanted a piece of the war, and traveling along with Sherman was his way to get it. He becomes a documenter of the march. He wrote a diary that becomes really an indispensable record of what happens on the march. Because he was a real war booster, and he was very proud of his unionism, he always was very careful to interview enslaved people and ask them about their experiences, and so he became a real documenter for me and someone I could look to as a source. Another person I think is really important is Garrison Frazier. Garrison Frazier is a pastor in Savannah. He is the person who, when Sherman has this meeting with the 20 black religious leaders, he is appointed as their spokesman. He had bought his own freedom and his wife's freedom 10 years before this meeting. And nonetheless, here he is in this moment, in this meeting in Green Mansion on Madison Square in Savannah, essentially holding court with two of the most powerful men in the country. and Stanton is a lawyer. He quizzes Frazier on the meaning of slavery, on the meaning of freedom. Frazier answers him with just incredible precision and aplomb, and really, I think, probably impressed Stanton with his answers. And would later go on to offer a vision for what freedom could look like after the Civil War. And there's one moment that I think encapsulates the story that I'm trying to tell, which is that Stanton asked him, well, how have you come by your opinions? What gives you the authority to be able to say this? And he says, well, come by my opinions in my conversations with my peers, but also in my ministry to the many refugees that have followed your army, a number that has surpassed even my own expectation. And this to me is one of those great kind of tidbits of history that you find, because it suggests to me that despite not physically being in the room, the refugees nonetheless, by their sheer movement behind Sherman's army, found a way to kind of have a presence in the room, to have their political ideas, their wants, their desires heard. Not just heard, but now have them heard by Sherman and Stanton, these incredibly powerful men, policymakers. So Frazier, Hitchcock are too important, but really it's the refugees themselves that were always the people I think that were most inspiring.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I'd love to open it up to any questions you all might have. So, yes?
I have two questions. One, can you tell us a little something about Sherman himself? What was his background? Mm-hmm. How did he get to be at that place at that time to do what he did, and what was his own feeling about slavery, if we know it? And the second question is, when you were talking about all the soldiers who were writing their experiences, infers there was a large number of literate people in that army. Is that a correct inference? And I find that a little unusual.
Yeah, well, as far as I can tell, there was a decent number of literate folks. What's interesting is that many of them were German speakers. I found a lot of sources that were actually written in German.
That's so good.
Which was sort of interesting. But one of the really interesting sources is many of them would write their own histories of their regiment. This was something that was very popular. And sometimes you would have folks, writing a kind of personal history as a stand-in for the regiment's history. But sometimes it would be someone who would collect memories from their own peers, and they would compile this together. And this was a really important source for me. And so as far as I can tell, I think there were decent amounts of literature, at least some folks who could write things down on behalf of other people in the army. Sherman is a fascinating character, interesting character. Before the war, I think he would describe himself, as something of a professional failure. He, like most men of his generation, he viewed the Mexican-American War as the great war of his generation. But what's interesting about Sherman's position in that war is he never actually fights in it. He's sent to California, but by the time he arrives in California, the fighting there is done. And this is important because it means that he doesn't see any combat, and so he can't get promoted as many of his peers do. He doesn't have that in his back pocket to use to rise in the army. And so this leads him eventually to get out of the army, to go into banking, which was a profession that he did not even like really and had no proficiency for. And even worse, he goes to bank in California at a time when the crest of the gold rush is waning. He's forced to close his shop, and then he goes to New York, and he sets up another bank in New York just as the Panic of 1857 happens.
Great timing.
And so he ends up going out of banking. At one point, he becomes a paralegal despite never taking the bar in Kansas. And he's ready to basically just accept life, whatever may come, when he gets an offer to run a military college in Alexandria, Louisiana. It's a new college, and this is the predecessor to LSU. And he is in Louisiana. He's finally happy. He's finally got a paycheck that's enough for him to live on and his family when the war begins. And he ends up leaving. It's sort of dicey for him down there anyway because his brother is a Republican senator, which people suspect him of having, him being Sherman, having Republican anti-slavery sensibilities. But Sherman himself is someone who was very Southern in his views. He spent most of his career in the Army in the South. When the war happens, he doesn't see slavery as being a central issue. He thinks that secession and national integrity is the issues that are most important. And even as the war begins to evolve, he resists its evolution. He doesn't see it as being important. He thinks that freedom is really an abstraction. It is nothing but a burden to his army. He doesn't see that his army should have any business engaging with free people and following through on emancipation. He thinks this is an issue for judges and politicians like his brother. He begins to slowly change his tune in Georgia. By now, I think he recognizes that targeting slavery is a way to win the war. I also think he begins to realize that being, or at least styling himself as a liberator, is good for him politically. So he's slowly beginning to evolve his position, though that might also be putting it a little bit charitably. But in other words, he's someone who always was a reluctant liberator at best, and someone who always resisted the evolution of the Civil War.
Was he a West Pointer?
He was, yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
When you decided to write the book, did you do like an extensive retracing of the march, or since you've done it so many times before? I asked because one of my relatives was one of the Indiana boys.
Oh, is that right?
And I really want to retrace the whole march sometime. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's one of those things. I grew up outside Athens, Georgia, and my entire life, my family would take many trips down to Savannah, and then we would vacation in Savannah, Jekyll Island, Hilton Head, Fripp Island, all these islands along the coast. For all of that trip, except for maybe the first 30 minutes, you are essentially on the path of the march. And now it's the same trip that I take when I go back to my family's house from Savannah. And my wife is from Atlanta, and we drive 16 to 75 all the time. And I guess just growing up in Georgia, you know, taking trips on the bus to go to high school football games, to go to Macon, Milledgeville for different reasons. Many of the sites that appear in the book are pretty familiar to me. And so I've never done a deliberate retracing, in part because I think just like having grown up there, you know, it's all pretty familiar to me. But for anyone that does, funny enough, I mean, all of Sherman's experience in Georgia basically follows, from Chattanooga to Atlanta, follows right down I-75 north, and then the initial path of the march follows essentially 75 to 16, or Interstate 20, just off 20 down to Savannah. So if you just drive through Georgia interstates, you follow the path.
Other questions? Yeah.
Did Sherman anticipate that he was going to attract that many refugees, considering the experiences he and Grant had in the Vicksburg campaign, including using black troops?
Yeah, that's a great question. Presumably he would have, because even when he was in Memphis as the military governor, which was a position he held before Atlanta, he dealt with this same very question of what to do with free people who came to his lines. And even when he was in Memphis, he relished the idea, while he wasn't very happy to have these free people in his lines, he often relished telling slaveholders that no, you're not going to get them back. And so presumably he, I think, expected this to happen, but I think it's the scale that he didn't quite expect. The amount of people to follow his army is one that I think surprised him. Whether he should have been surprised or not, you know, I don't know. I would think he probably should have seen it coming. And your point about black soldiers is a good one. This is something, too, that speaks to Sherman's position on the way the war evolved. The raising of black troops is something that Sherman resisted from the very beginning and all the way through the campaign in Georgia. And it comes to a head outside of Atlanta because he has developed such a reputation for resisting raising and having black troops in his army that Lincoln actually writes to him asking for his cooperation. And Sherman basically tells him, we'll deal with this after Atlanta. He says, basically, I understand your order, I understand it, but you know, I've got bigger fish to fry at the moment, and we'll talk about it later, and he never does. And he basically puts Lincoln off. But that letter that he writes to Lincoln actually winds up in the press. And so this becomes a real kind of moment of real embarrassment for him when the rest of the country realizes how he had resisted Lincoln. He'd been resisting the raising of black troops for so long. And so it becomes a real kind of black eye for him after Atlanta falls.
Yes.
Hey, Robert Northern. I'm not a historian, but I just finished reading the Demon of Unrest which was earlier, the initiation of the war. And it seemed to me after reading the book that Lincoln, President Lincoln, was really instrumental in initiating that fighting, especially at South Carolina. Was he involved in this march with he was still president, I believe, right?
He was, that's correct, yeah.
Was there Lincoln involvement in that, as far as you know?
None that I can tell. In fact, there's a great moment where Sherman's brother John, who's a U.S. Senator, goes to Lincoln, asking Lincoln for knowledge about what the status is of his brother and his army, and Lincoln says, we know what hole he's gone down, but we don't know which one he's going to come out from. And as far as I can tell, when the planning for it, for Sherman, was done almost exclusively with Grant, to a lesser extent Stanton, Secretary of War, and to a greater extent Henry Halleck, who was the Army's Chief of Staff and a former old friend of Sherman's. But Lincoln really, I think, has a hands-off approach to Sherman's and his strategy. So.
Which is partially intentional, right? Because Sherman wants to keep the Confederate military from knowing where he's going as well.
That's true.
So he does. I mean, you've talked about several leaks to the press already,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So Sherman doesn't want his plans appearing in the press, so that whatever resistance the Confederacy might have mustered could be concentrated. I think we maybe have time for one more. Yes.
If I'm not hogging. The description of Sherman's pre-March life with the string of perceived failures, it kind of sounds like Grant's life before the Civil War. Does that speak to how hard it was to get work, or does that speak to their personalities, or because they both turned out to be major leaders?
Yeah. No, I think there's a reason I think they see themselves as kind of comrades in arms, and they have such a good relationship because their biographies are so similar. I mean, they're both from the Midwest. They both kind of are on the verge of failure before the war. And so, I mean, I think it speaks in part to the difficulty of just life in the 19th century in general. And the 1850s were a tumultuous time. It's a time of real economic booms and busts, time of tumultuous politics. The Army was a vehicle for success, but as Sherman's career indicates, it's not one where you'd always get rich from, and so it can have a real limit to how much money you can make. And so I think they both. It's hard world in the 1850s, but they definitely have a similar biography that I think is foundational for their relationship as it develops over the course of the war.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so Ben is going to be over here signing books, which are back available for purchase at the desk. I'm sure he would be delighted to answer any other questions that you happen to have. But please join me in thanking Ben for being with us this evening.